In New York City, respect isn't given, it's negotiated. In some neighborhoods, your badge decides your worth. But sometimes, the man you underestimate is the one who rewrites the rules. The morning rush painted Brooklyn in metallic gray. Sirens hummed in the distance, yellow cabs darted through traffic like angry wasps, and the 12th precinct buzzed with its usual Monday rhythm. Cops clutching paper cups of burnt coffee, rookies filing reports, detectives swapping stories from the weekend. Detective Mark Reynolds sat at his desk, boots on the edge, cleaning his service pistol with the same lazy confidence he wore like a second uniform. 10 years on the force had carved lines of arrogance across his face. The kind of arrogance that comes from believing you've seen everything and everyone's a suspect until proven otherwise. Mark wasn't born bad, but he had grown comfortable confusing suspicion for instinct. To him, the city's problems always had the same color, the same voice, the same neighborhood. He'd tell himself, I just call it like I see it, but what he saw was filtered through bias he never cared to confront. That morning, the station doors opened and a man stepped in. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp navy suit that looked out of place among scuffed uniforms and coffee-stained shirts. Stephen Brooks. Early 40s. Deep brown skin. A calm steadiness in his eyes, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, it commanded it. He approached the front desk politely, flashing a quick smile at the receptionist. Good morning. I'm here to meet with the precinct captain. Stephen Brooks. The young officer behind the counter blinked. The captain's out on patrol this morning. Can I ask what it's regarding? Department assignment, Stephen replied. I'll wait. The receptionist nodded, slightly nervous. It wasn't every day that someone walked in that confidently asking for the captain. She offered him a seat. But before she could, Mark noticed the exchange from across the room. He set his coffee down. Hey, Marcy, he called to the receptionist. Who's that guy? Another community complaint. Stephen turned toward the voice, calm, patient. No complaint. Just here for a meeting. Mark smirked. Sure you are. Let's see some ID then. Stephen reached into his jacket and produced a leather badge holder, gold emblem, official engraving, department seal. Mark barely glanced at it before letting out a short laugh. Come on, man. You printed this thing at a souvenir shop? That's the worst fake badge I've seen all week. Stephen kept his composure. It's not fake, detective. If you take a closer look, you'll see. I've seen enough, Mark interrupted, stepping forward. You impersonating a cop? That's a felony. The room quieted. Officers nearby turned to watch. Stephen sighed, not out of fear, but disappointment. You're making a mistake. Funny, Mark said. That's what they all say right before I cuff them. And before anyone could intervene, Mark had Stephen spun around against the wall, arms behind his back, cuffs snapping shut. The metal clink echoed off the tiled floor like a public verdict. You have the right to remain silent, Mark said loudly, almost enjoying the moment. Stephen didn't resist. He looked over his shoulder and said calmly, You have the right to be very embarrassed soon. The line drew a few nervous chuckles from the watching officers. One rookie muttered, What's he mean by that? Mark smirked, waving off the comment. Means he's gonna call his imaginary lawyer. But when Sergeant Diaz hurried in moments later, the laughter stopped cold. Reynolds, Diaz barked. What the hell are you doing? Caught this guy flashing a fake badge, Sarge. Diaz's face went pale. Fake? Are you insane? That's Lieutenant Stephen Brooks from Internal Affairs. The room froze. Mark blinked, the smirk sliding off his face. Wait, what? Diaz shoved past him, unlocking the cuffs. Sir, I am so sorry about this. Stephen rubbed his wrist gently, his composure still unbroken. It's all right, Sergeant. I've been through worse. Detective Reynolds here was just doing his job. Perhaps a little too eagerly. The line was polite, but the tone carried steel beneath it. Mark's mouth opened, closed, opened again, nothing came out. He wanted to apologize, but pride glued his tongue. Stephen simply nodded. I'll be sure to note his enthusiasm in my report. And with that he left, calm, unreadable, disappearing into the elevator as the doors slid shut. Mark stood motionless. The entire room stared. His confidence cracked, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: fear. He's from internal affairs. He'll destroy me. But what Mark didn't know, what no one knew, was that Stephen's visit that day wasn't about any random assignment. It was the first step in something much bigger, a departmental reshuffle that would soon make him Captain Stephen Brooks, commanding officer of the 12th Precinct. And for Mark Reynolds, the man who'd mocked him, it would be a reckoning years in the making. Pride has a strange way of blinding a man. It convinces him that his version of the world is the truth, until reality walks through the same door wearing a higher rank. 3 weeks passed. The precinct returned to its rhythm: paperwork, patrols, politics. But Detective Mark Reynolds hadn't slept properly since that day. Every time a memo arrived, every time his name echoed across the hallway, his chest tightened. Was it internal affairs? Was Stephen Brooks writing a report that could end his career? He kept telling himself, nah, he's forgotten about it. But deep down, he knew better. It was a cold Monday morning when everything changed. The officers gathered in the main hall for an emergency meeting. The air was stiff with curiosity. A few whispered theories floated: new district orders, budget cuts, maybe another reshuffle. The current captain, a gray-haired man named Wallace, stood at the front. His expression was neutral, his tone official. "All right, everyone, listen up. As you know, this precinct's been under review following several misconduct reports. Headquarters decided we need fresh leadership to restore credibility. Effective immediately, we'll be welcoming a new commanding officer." Mark leaned back in his chair, half listening, until the captain said the next name. "Please welcome Captain Stephen Brooks, transferred from Internal Affairs." The room went silent, the kind of silence that makes every heartbeat audible. Stephen Brooks walked in, same calm eyes, same quiet presence, but this time wearing a dark blue captain's uniform. The gold insignia on his chest gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. Mark's stomach dropped. Stephen's gaze swept across the room. He didn't rush his words. He didn't need to. His voice was steady, low, commanding, respectful. "Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to serve as your new captain. I know this precinct has faced its challenges, but we're going to rebuild, not just our reputation, but our purpose." He paused, letting the words settle. "We protect people. All people. That's what this badge stands for. And that's what I expect from every officer who wears it." He let the silence linger, then added, almost softly, "Respect is a two-way street. Those who give it will get it back tenfold." It wasn't an outburst. It wasn't even a threat. But everyone in the room knew exactly what it meant. Mark tried not to move, not to breathe. He could feel eyes shifting toward him, subtle, knowing glances. The rumor had already spread. Everyone remembered that day. Over the next several weeks, life at the 12th Precinct changed. Stephen's leadership was unlike anything they'd seen. He wasn't loud or theatrical. He didn't use fear to enforce discipline. Instead, he used precision, empathy, accountability. He scheduled workshops on procedural ethics. He required officers to attend bias training. He introduced street immersion programs where detectives were paired with community leaders. Some officers appreciated it. Others grumbled. But for Mark Reynolds, it was torture. Every meeting felt personal. Every new rule felt like a mirror held to his face. He told himself, "He's targeting me." But Stephen never mentioned the arrest. Never raised his voice. That made it worse. Then came the midpoint twist, subtle but devastating. Late one evening, Mark stayed behind to finish a report. Most of the lights were off. The precinct was quiet except for the hum of vending machines. As he typed, he noticed a manila folder left on his desk. No name. Just a sticky note. "Review immediately." He opened it and froze. Inside were photocopies of his last 6 case files, annotated in red ink. Notes on inconsistencies, improper detainment procedures, excessive language during arrests, and a typed memo attached at the end. To Captain Stephen Brooks. From Internal Review Division. Subject: officer misconduct pattern, Detective Mark Reynolds. His chest tightened. It wasn't just that Stephen knew, it was that he'd been quietly building a case. Mark's hand shook. He shoved the folder into a drawer, heart pounding. He couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, Stephen called him into the office. The door closed softly behind them. Stephen gestured for him to sit. There was no anger in his face, just the kind of calm that made nerves worse. "Detective Reynolds," he began, "how long have you been with this department?" 10 years, sir." 10 years, Stephen repeated thoughtfully. "That's long enough to know that your badge is supposed to serve, not intimidate." Mark swallowed. "Sir, if this is about the other week—" "It's not just about the other week," Stephen said. "It's about every other week like it. The ones that didn't make headlines." He turned a page on his desk, the same documents Mark had seen the night before. "I don't need to destroy your career, detective. I need to understand how you lost your way." The question wasn't rhetorical. It was sincere. That made it worse than an accusation. Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. Stephen leaned forward. "I know what it's like to wear this uniform and have people doubt you before you even open your mouth. I spent years proving I belonged in rooms people thought I didn't deserve to enter. But I never let that justify treating anyone less than human." He let the silence hang. "That's where the difference lies, Reynolds. Between us." That night, Mark sat in his car outside the station for a long time, staring at his own reflection in the windshield. For the first time, he didn't see a detective. He saw the kind of man he'd arrested, defensive, bitter, blind to the damage he caused. It hit him like a slow realization, not that he was being punished, but that he'd been given a mirror. And the man holding it was the same one he'd handcuffed for looking suspicious. When the doors of the 12th precinct closed that night, the building finally exhaled. Rain had stopped. Only the city's distant lights hummed against the glass. For most of the men and women under that roof, the week would pass like any other. For Detective Mark Reynolds, however, the hours unfolded with the weight of consequence. He woke each morning with a small pit in his stomach, as if a part of him had been left cuffed on that tiled floor. He tried to bury it under busyness, overtime, follow-ups, the small ceremonies of policing that keep even guilty consciences moving. But the folder Stephen had left, the red ink annotated files, the quiet memo from internal review, lived in his mind like a pulse. It wasn't just threat of discipline. It was the record of what his work had been: sharp practices, loose reports, shortcuts that hurt people who never deserved to be hurt. Captain Stephen Brooks did not hurry his victory. He did not parade or point fingers. He had the patience of a man who had been underestimated his whole life and learned early that the patient hand often corrects the world more completely than the angry one. His first weeks were not bombastic reforms but precise, small changes: a community liaison brought in for a coffee, a requirement that every new arrest report list the reasons for probable cause in clear language, a mandate that officers who used force file body cam footage along with their narrations. These changes were quiet, and because they were quiet they were dangerous to people whose habits depended on noise and bluster. Mark felt each adjustment like a personal reduction. Where once he had commanded the room by volume and threat, he now faced meetings that demanded explanation, justification, and sometimes humility. Meetings where he would have to say, on the record, why he had thought a suspect deserved a certain treatment. Meetings where the community leader sat across from him and asked, without malice but with firm expectation, whether the badge he carried meant he would protect or persecute. At first, Mark responded with the old tools: sarcasm, anger, the flinch of someone who felt cornered. But Stephen did something softer and more effective. He gave Mark a mirror. One night in January, as snow dusted the city in fine white, the precinct received a call. A teenage kid had been pulled up by neighbors, accused of stealing from a bodega. Mark was on duty. Old reflexes surged like muscle memory: handcuffs, firm commands, the quick assumption that fit a familiar script. He arrived quickly, breath visible in the cold air, and found the boy, hands trembling, trying to explain. The shopkeeper shouted that he saw the boy slip something away. Mark stepped forward, his voice starting to rise. But then he saw, truly saw, the boy's face. Terrified, ashamed, more afraid of being noticed than of being punished. A piece of Stephen's lesson caught him like an unexpected net. The boy's hands were empty. The sandwich on the counter had been taken from a trash bag. The boy, hungry and scared, had grabbed what he thought he could eat. It was not a burglary. It was hunger. Mark's hands, the old hands that had reached for cuffs so easily, reached instead for money. He put cash on the counter, not to buy the shopkeeper's forgiveness but to let the boy go without shame. Later, he wrote a different kind of report, not arrest, but a referral, social services, food programs, a youth outreach worker Stephen's team now employed. When word reached Stephen, he called Mark into the office. Mark expected escalation. Instead, Captain Brooks asked one question, quiet and direct. "Why did you decide mercy tonight?" Mark, for once, answered honestly. "I remembered being unjustified a week ago. I kept seeing that look." Stephen nodded and said, "That memory can either destroy you or teach you. I'd rather it teach you." The offer in Stephen's voice was not absolution. It was an invitation to change. The internal review did not vanish. The files were thorough, names, dates, notations of poor procedure that stretched back further than Mark cared to admit. In another era, the department might have quietly shelved them, kept its own. But Stephen intended to reroute that impulse. He published a transparent summary of the audit's goals and offered the officers two paths: corrective remediation through training and community work, or formal disciplinary processing. The message was clear: the department would not be shamed into cover-ups anymore. Some officers left. Some griped and consoled themselves with the stories of how it used to be. But many stayed. Underway, slowly, the culture shifted. Where a hard hand once dominated, an expectation of patience and accountability established itself like new masonry. The neighborhood noticed fewer late-night stops that ended in humiliation, more community meetings where residents actually spoke and were listened to. Mark's first step into real change was not an act of heroism but a small, steady habit. He stopped assuming guilt until he had reason, and he wrote his reports as if the person whose life he described might later read them. It sounds simple, but it carries the force of a profession rebuilt. Weeks into the change, Mark was assigned to lead a new community outreach detail, part of Stephen's plan to create real bridges. He resented the assignment. He also took it. He started in a gymnasium full of kids, a place he would have once bypassed for a more serious scene. He taught self-defense classes, yes, but he also listened. He sat with fathers who remembered being watched, mothers who remembered being humiliated, and teenagers who had never known police could be there for them. He learned the names of the corner stores and the neighborhood saints. He listened to Marcus, the teen he had once nearly arrested, now a volunteer handing out sandwiches. Marcus looked at him the way people look at relievers, with suspicion first, then the small, bright possibility of trust. One afternoon, Mark led a session where he brought his own story, not the prideful, selective version he used to tell, but the whole, humbling truth. He told kids about mistakes and what he learned from them. He told them how one man had shown him the dignity of being corrected, not punished. Marcus listened, then raised his hand. "Do you think cops can change?" he asked. Mark paused longer than he liked. Then he said, "I don't know if they all will. But what I know now is this: people can. I'm changing. Maybe others will too." The applause that followed wasn't for Mark the badge carrier. It was for Mark the man who admitted he had been wrong and would try to be better. That moment, more than any disciplinary file, was the hinge of his redemption. Stephen's role in the story was never to crush Mark, it was to hold the system accountable and to give those who would accept it a second chance. He knew coercion breeds resentment. He believed correction coupled with restoration breeds change. That meant once the department's patterns were publicly reviewed and the channels for accountability made clear, some officers would be disciplined. Mark was not exempt. When the formal review concluded, the decision struck that Mark would be reassigned from general patrol duties to lead the community outreach unit for a probationary period, while maintaining internal oversight on his reports and undergoing repeated sensitivity and procedure training. His rank remained the same. His reputation had to be rebuilt with actions, not titles. There was public paperwork and there were conversations behind closed doors that Mark wished had never existed. For the precinct, it was a new era, one in which cover-ups were harder and corrections more visible. That day, Stephen called a meeting. People wondered if he would triumph in a punitive speech. He didn't. He told a story instead, a small one, about a time as a young officer when he had been laughed at, dismissed, treated as a curiosity because of his skin. He told them how he'd learned to show up to rooms that had never expected him, not to prove them wrong, but to do the job better than they expected. "I could have stayed angry," he said. "Anger would have been easier. But anger breaks the man holding it and heals nothing. So we will correct what must be corrected. And we will build what must be built." He looked directly at Mark. "Rebuilding takes hands, detective. Use yours." Mark felt something loosen inside him. Not absolution, but purpose. He would not forget what had happened. He would not pretend nothing had been wrong. He would, instead, be the officer who learned how to wield shame into improvement. The precinct's public perception shifted. Community leaders began to meet Stephen at the door. Children waved when Mark walked past. Small store owners paused to laugh with officers about simple things. It wasn't a miracle. It was consistent effort. Months later, the story of the man who had once been mocked for a fake badge became far more powerful than the gossip that had spread through the halls. Stephen Brooks was lauded by some for his calm leadership. Critics were quieter because outcomes were improving and complaints dwindled. Mark, once a caricature of old-school hardness, found a new self, useful, introspective, and more human. On a spring night, the precinct held a small ceremony. Stephen stood briefly and handed Mark a plaque. It was modest, an engraved plate that read, "For outstanding commitment to community rebuilding and sincere efforts toward changed practice." Mark's hands trembled as he took it. He tried to speak and found only gratitude that was deeper than pride. Later, in a quieter moment, Mark walked to the precinct lobby, the very place where he had cuffed Stephen not so long ago. He found no urge to replay the humiliation, no desire for retribution. Instead, he placed his palm on the same wall and whispered, "Thank you." Stephen had given him a chance to be better. He had taught an entire precinct that correction without compassion is not correction at all. He had shown that the person you insult can be your salvation, not your enemy. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to breathe a little easier. Reports were cleaner. Arrests were fewer but more just. The people who had once viewed the precinct with suspicion now came to its community nights and found food, guidance, and people who truly listened. The small satellite of police work Mark led started to mirror Stephen's ethic, that enforcement must be married to empathy if safety is to be real and lasting. Stephen's final gift to the precinct was not in the form of decrees. It was a quiet handbook he insisted those under his command read, the badge as stewardship. It laid out, in practical terms, how to turn authority into responsibility. It began with a sentence Stephen repeated in public and private: "You will have the power to make someone's worst day into a memory they carry forever. Use it to heal, not to wound." As that ethic took root, Mark found his voice again, but different, softer, wiser, more rigorous. He knew there were officers who would never change. He knew systems could backslide. But he also had seen the boy on the curb, Marcus, and he had felt the small, incandescent change that comes from being heard and treated like a human being. One late afternoon, months after everything began, a reporter asked Stephen, in a short interview on precinct grounds, what listeners should learn from the precinct's turnaround. He thought for a moment, and then said, not in triumph but in invitation. "We are not defined by the worst mistake we make. We are defined by what we do after. If you lead people, lead them with humility. If you judge people, be ready to be judged in return." As the precinct quieted that night and the city's lights blinked like 1,000 patient eyes, Mark walked home slower than he used to, his coat zipped against the breeze. He walked past the same sidewalk where once he had assumed an identity based on color and posture. He paused, and this time he felt not the vindication of being right, but the responsibility of being better. Captain Stephen Brooks watched the precinct from his office window for a long time that evening. He had been handcuffed once by a man who had been wrong. He had endured the embarrassment, let it refine rather than harden him. When he closed the file drawer, he did not feel triumph. He felt a steward's satisfaction, a duty done, a house straightened, a system nudged toward justice. Outside, the city moved on. Sirens, laughter, the hum of everyday living. But in that small precinct, a new lawless thing was dying. The habit of seeing people by the color of their uniform or their skin before seeing them as human. It would take more than one captain to finish the work. But the tilt had begun. Before you judge someone by the way they look, the sound of their voice, or the clothes they wear, pause and remember this. Respect costs nothing and builds nations. Prejudice blinds us to brilliance. Humility opens doors we never knew existed. Whether you stand in New York, Australia, Europe, London, or Tokyo, character speaks louder than appearance. So the next time you hold power, use it to lift, not crush. Greatness is not measured by how high you rise, but by how many you raise with. Hit that like button if you believe respect should never depend on rank, race, or title. Subscribe to Hidden Tales Stories for more true, human stories that uncover the hidden lessons behind every act of arrogance, every moment of justice, and every redemption that begins with humility. And tell us in the comments below, do you think people truly change when they're given a second chance?